Hey everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day and thank you so much for joining me today for another art video. In today's video, I'm going to be sharing my top 8 tips for combining ink with watercolor. More specifically, I'm going to be talking about ink pens and watercolor washes. I sat down the other day to give thought to the specific points that I wish I knew when I was getting started with this combo of mediums that I feel could have helped me progress much faster, would have helped me avoid some frustration, and would have led me to arrive at better results more quickly. And these are the things that I want to share with you today. I absolutely love the combination of ink and watercolor. I feel these mediums complement each other so well. I love how the transparency, looseness, and vibrancy of watercolor washes combine and complement the more opaque, slightly more controlled line work and mark making created with pen and ink. And another thing I love so much about this combination of mediums is that there is so much room for exploration and play and bringing our own style into our work. There's so many ways that we can move through the process itself, either by doing first the ink work or first the watercolor and then move on to the other medium, or do some sort of sandwich like what I'm going to be doing on screen today. You're going to see me get started with watercolor, then move on to the pen and ink, then back to watercolor. But aside from this, there's also an infinite amount of degrees that we can decide to use in terms of the level of detail and description that we're going to be doing in terms of textures, values, etc. when it comes to both mediums. Usually, but not always, it really depends on the artist and what she or he is going for. But we see ink work used to define the edges of shapes and forms. We see alternative shading or mark making techniques with ink to describe different values, highlights, midtones, and darks in the different elements that we're seeing in the piece. We also see different mark making techniques to describe textures. And usually the ink work is a little bit more controlled, whereas we see loose and playful washes of color when it comes to the watercolor. However, within this, there is an infinite amount of ways that we can be using alternative shading or mark making techniques. Are you going to be using hatching, cross-hatching, stippling, scribbling? Just one, a combination of several of these? Are you just going to be describing the edges and staying away from any sort of mark-making techniques aside from that? And when it comes to watercolor, are you going to be using only one layer? Are you going to be doing more? Are you going to be using watercolor to describe just values or textures or a combo of both? So you get my drift. There is an infinite amount of degrees when it comes to that description that we can do via both mediums. And as I'm going to be talking about later, it's so important with this kind of piece in which we're combining two different mediums to go in with at least some sort of loose strategy, because during the process it can be so easy to keep adding and adding and adding with both mediums just to end up with a piece that looks very overwhelming and very overdone instead of loose and fresh and sketchy, which is usually what we want. Okay, so with all that said, let's go ahead and get started with the 8 tips that I want to share with you today. But before getting into that, I just want to send a huge warm welcome to everyone that is just visiting my channel today for the very first time. Welcome. I am so happy that you found me, and do consider subscribing because every single week I share a new video with art tips, drawing and painting tutorials, and encouragement and mindset tips for artists. I'd love to have you here and become part of this growing art community. And do remember to click on that little notification bell so that you can be informed of when my new videos come out. Otherwise, you might or might not find out about them. All right, so moving on to the very first tip for creating effective pen and watercolor pieces. And this first one is going to be to make sure that you're using waterproof ink. Make sure that you do your research before buying the pens that you're intending to use with watercolor. And always, always, always do some testing before getting to work on your final pieces or those pieces that you're intending to spend more time on. Personally, I enjoy using fine liner pens in various tip sizes, and you're gonna constantly see me use either my Micron pens or my Staedtler pigment liners. By the way, all of the supplies that you're gonna be seeing me use today are gonna be left down below for you in the description box of this video in case you'd like to go and check them out. When it comes to different pen types that you can use to create this type of artwork, there are mainly 4 out there. There are dip pens, which you're constantly dipping into your tub of ink throughout the process. There are brush pens, which are used a lot by calligraphy artists, but can also be used to create beautiful artwork. And they're amazing because they're able to create a lot of line weight variation, but you do have to practice control over that softer tip there. And finally, there are fountain pens. So you buy the shell, so to speak, of the pen that you like, and then you buy your ink tub separately and you fill it up yourself with your ink of choice, which is obviously a very custom kind of tool that you can create for yourself. Personally, for me, is an option that I would do only until after I've explored ink more and have learned more about it and have maybe built up my skill a bit. And there are other types of what I would consider more normal looking pens out there, or at least more similar to what I would consider a normal pen I would use for writing purposes, everyday writing purposes. Sort of like the gel pens from Uniball. They have quite a few different pens that you can combine with watercolor. But even though I am a huge believer in using the resources that we have available to work on our art and develop our skills, and I've seen amazing drawings created with simple, common Bic pens. When it comes to combining ink with watercolor, which does of course entail us bringing in water into the picture, this does require us doing a little bit of work to set ourselves up for success and avoid just completely destroying drawings that we spent quite a bit of time on, and just avoid frustration. Whenever I am searching for a new pen to buy to create artwork with, I just like assuming that it does not have waterproof ink unless blatantly stated otherwise. Sometimes you're going to be able to see the term waterproof or fade proof along the barrel of the pen somewhere or in the label. And other times it's not as clear. You're going to see terms like water-based pigment and things like that, which for me is a little bit confusing because when I hear the term water-based, I connect it to something like watercolor, which is water soluble, which is going to smear and smudge as you add in the water, right? But then I hear the term pigment and I know that pigments are actually particles that don't dissolve in water. So what I am getting at is that things can get kind of confusing with some of the terms that you're gonna find in these pens or even in these tubs of ink. I'm gonna leave a link to a guest blog post over at my website down below in the description box that a pen and ink expert wrote for my website that contains lots of different tried and true options for both ink pens as well as ink tubs that are awesome to use in combination with watercolor, which are all waterproof. So you can check that out down below in the description box. One last thing I want to say is that it's so important to allow that ink to dry before going in with watercolor. Even if it's waterproof, it's important to allow that ink to settle into the paper and to completely dry to avoid any smearing or smudging. Whenever I am using either of the 2 brands of pens that I love using, whether they're Micron or Staedtler pigment liners, I am usually good with allowing that ink to dry for around 20 to 30 minutes. And I go in with my watercolor and nothing smears or anything. All right, so moving on to tip number 2, and this is going to be to choose your paper wisely. So first and foremost, we have to make sure that we're using paper that is intended for water-soluble mediums because we're gonna be bringing in water into the picture. Aside from that, I would say that I wouldn't use anything that is thinner than 140 pounds in thickness. Thin paper can be super irritating to work on, especially when we're just getting started and haven't completely gained that control over our water when painting with watercolor. And also because we're working with pen and they are nice and pointy, we don't want to be using this type of sharp tool on a wet paper. It can be very easily damaged. And aside from this, the texture of your paper is going to have a great impact on both your process as well as the end product. So when we're using pens, obviously they have a nib, they have a little point that can skip a lot if our paper has a lot of tooth or texture to it. So usually I like working with paper that has a very small amount of texture to it that is going to allow me to create those lines and those marks as smoothly as possible. For this particular piece that you're seeing me work on, I am using cold press watercolor paper from Strathmore. This is one of their 100% cotton ready cut sheets, and it has very little texture to it, even though it's cold press, and usually cold press paper has some amount of texture. So just make sure that you are considering that texture before getting started. And if you don't want any texture on your paper at all, you could consider investing in hot press watercolor paper. Tip number 3 is going to be to choose your paint brushes wisely, depending on the level of looseness or detail that you're trying to achieve. Usually what I am going for with this kind of piece is a loose, fresh, sketchy feel. And because of this, because I know that I am not going to be adding way too much detail with watercolor and I don't want to start getting too finicky, I like just using the largest paintbrush that I feel I can get away with for the size of the piece on hand and the subject itself. For example, for this piece, I used 3 different paintbrushes. I initially went in to paint those first washes of color in the large portion of the sky and the large portion of those greens using my large mop brush. And then I switched on over to using my size 16 round brush. It's what I'm using right now. And then in the very final parts of this painting process, when I am adding in a little bit more detail and texture, only in specific little areas, I go in with a size 3 round brush. The larger the paintbrushes you use, the more paint you're going to be able to soak up with those bristles or load up in those bristles, and you're not going to have to go back into your paint back and forth again and again. You're going to be able to just lay down that wash of color more quickly. And this is really key for that loose and fresh look when it comes to painting with watercolor. The less moving around of paint and the less layering you do, the better. As long as your paintbrushes have a nice point at the end, you can get away with using pretty large brushes in most cases. So don't overcomplicate it. Don't bring way too many different brushes into the picture. Just keep it nice and simple. And if you want looser, fresher, and I would recommend if you're looking for looser, fresher results, try to just challenge yourself to use larger brushes. All right, moving on to tip number 4, and this one is going to be to not be afraid of getting started with regular graphite pencils. You saw me do this in the beginning of this video. I got started creating my preliminary outline sketch with a pencil. And this is something that I like doing, especially when I am working on a subject that requires knowledge of perspective or specific proportions. With this house, for example, whenever I'm drawing houses or buildings, perspective and 3D form comes into play. And I know that if that perspective or that sensation of 3D form is off, then my whole piece is going to be off. I have to make sure that I am starting with an effective outline sketch. And then once that is set with my graphite pencil, I know that I can move on and move a little bit quicker and a little bit more confidently when I am working with my pen and ink, which is of course a permanent medium. There is absolutely no shame in using regular graphite pencils when we're getting started. This way you can erase your mistakes easily and you can ensure that you're starting from a solid base. One tip that I want to offer within this is keep that preliminary graphite sketch nice and simple and only add in the largest shapes and the little things are going to make the later stages of this process easier for you. There is no need to start adding in way too much detail or to start shading in with graphite. Moving on to tip number 5, and this is to decide since the beginning, before getting started, whether you're going to be going in with your pen first and then your watercolor, or vice versa. As I said in the beginning of this video, neither of these are right or wrong or better or worse. It totally depends on your own way of doing things and the effects that you're going for. It is important to know, however, that if you're starting with pen and ink and then moving on to watercolor and you're using any colors that are not fully transparent, you can end up with a chalky look over your black ink, or you can even partially cover up that line work. So within this tip, if color transparency is something that is important for you for that end result, then make sure that you're using colors that are fully transparent, because as you probably know by now, each individual color, when it comes to watercolors, they have different properties, which is why it's so important to swatch out your colors. So choose your colors wisely. I'll make sure to leave a link to a video on swatching and important qualities to look for in watercolor paint down below for you in the description box in case you'd like to go and check it out. Moving on to tip number 6, and this is going to be to think of how you're going to be creating a sensation of balance between the two mediums. So what I mean by this is really go in with at least some sort of strategy as to how much you're going to be doing with ink and how much you're going to be doing with watercolor. Because as I said in the beginning of this video, it's very easy to start adding way too much detail with your ink and start adding way too much detail with your watercolor, which is not going to lead to fresh, loose, sketchy results. Before getting started, I always like asking myself things like, how many layers am I going to be adding with my watercolor? Am I going to be describing values with hatching, cross-hatching, contour lines, alternative shading techniques using my ink? Or am I going to be describing values using only watercolor? How much texture am I going to be adding in with either medium? You know, asking yourself these questions before going in so that you know exactly when to stop yourself, so that you don't end up adding and adding and adding with both mediums and just end up overly describing things and making things look overly complicated and heavy and even overwhelming for the viewer. Moving on to tip number 7, and this has to do with this last tip that I just shared. This one is to suggest and not to shout. So if you're using a reference photo or something that you have in front of you in real life, practice synthesizing the information that you're taking in and focusing on what's important of whatever it is you're seeing in order to create that illusion of believable form or shadow or light or texture and leave out the rest. Our viewers' eyes and brains are going to be able to put 2 and 2 together, and it's not necessary to overly describe everything. It's very common that when we're just getting started with creating art, we get overwhelmed with all of the small details in whatever it is we're trying to draw or paint. And we feel that we need to describe every single little piece of information we're taking in our artwork. And this is not the case at all. We have to train ourselves to simplify, to deconstruct, and to use only what we need from our references to arrive at the results that we're looking for. And we don't necessarily have to bring in absolutely everything. All right, and moving on to the very last tip for today. This one is to really work on your line weight variation when it comes to using pen and ink. And this is something that I thoroughly get into in a past video that I shared on pen and ink tips for beginners. I'm gonna make sure to leave a link to that thorough video down below in the description box as well. But essentially, unless we're going for a cartoony coloring book page look, we want to make sure that we're developing line weight variation throughout the line work and the alternative shading techniques and mark making techniques that we use when we're using pen and ink. Essentially, you want to stay away from the look of heavy lines with a consistent weight from one end to the other end, and slash or from obvious looking outlines around every single element that you draw. So you want a line weight variation within the lines and marks that you add. Lines and marks that have a line weight variation to them have certain segments which look thinner and lighter, and other segments which look bolder and darker and thicker. 4 key things that I like taking into account in order to make sure I'm achieving a line weight variation throughout my pen and ink sketches are: number 1, obviously, you can achieve thicker, bolder lines using a larger pen tip, right, versus a smaller pen tip. But aside from this, there are 3 other things that you can play with. One of them is the speed at which you're moving your wrist or your arm as you're laying down those lines and marks. There's also the angle at which you're using your pen and the pressure that you're exerting on your paper. Try to play around with these depending on the thickness and the lightness that you're trying to achieve, either within one same line or mark or at a macro level in your entire sketch. You also want a variety of lines and marks. And this play with line weight variation makes your sketches look a lot more dynamic, a lot more interesting. And by making mindful use of your line weight variation, you can create a lot of impact and depth in your pieces, as opposed to the flatness that a consistent line weight all throughout tends to lead to. Did you enjoy this tutorial? I really, really hope you did. And if so, please make sure to check out everything that I'm offering over at my Patreon membership website, because for a very small amount a month, you get immediate access to my most exclusive resources in the form of real-time, step-by-step, fully narrated tutorials that I don't share anywhere else. All of the tutorials that I share over on Patreon include my downloadable outline sketch, my high-resolution reference photos, and my supply lists, including the list of specific colors that I use for the piece on hand. Patreon community members also have access to my weekly sketchbook prompts, which are designed to help you stay consistent and making progress as an artist. There's also a library of classes on art fundamentals that now has over 20 classes in it, and that gets added to each and every month. Monthly live Q&A sessions with me, in which community members get to ask me anything they'd like, feedback from me on your work, and much, much more. So go ahead and check it out. There are different tiers that you can join that give you access to different things, so you can pick whichever one you need. I'm going to make sure to leave a link to that down below in the description box. Alright everyone, that is going to do it for today's video. I really hope that you enjoyed it, that you learned something new, or that you found it inspiring. If you did like it, please make sure to give this video a thumbs up, because it really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and allows more artists to get to know about my channel. Thank you so very much for watching today. I really, really appreciate it. If you have any questions or comments for me, make sure to leave them down below in the comment section. I always love hearing from you guys and read every single one of your comments. Don't forget to subscribe so that I can see you next week for another video, and stay inspired. Bye guys!